Hello, my name is Joyce Tsai, Chief Curator of the Stanley Museum of Art and Associate Professor of Practice at the School of Art and Art History at the University of Iowa. I have the pleasure of introducing Roberto Lugo, who was awarded the Rome Prize this year. He's Assistant Professor of Ceramics at the Tyler School of Art and Architecture, Temple University. Lugo describes himself as a potter, educator, poet, public speaker, and community activist, but his body of work is nothing short of alchemical. His exquisitely designed glazed ceramic bodies integrate multiple stylistic vernaculars. He brings graffiti and urban fashion in contact with Limoges Rococo, Worcester porcelain, and Ming Dynasty blue and white. Lugo makes use of high fire porcelain because it was so rarefied that it was only used in the most exclusive circles for centuries. He uses this enduring medium to celebrate the achievements of long marginalized communities and to commemorate the work of those famous and anonymous who demand justice at enormous costs and often at odds with the prevailing currents of their time. As an art educator working in schools, senior centers, and his own childhood neighborhood, Lugo creates opportunities for individuals to see themselves and their communities anew with grace, unity of purpose, and to play. Without further ado, I introduce Roberto Lugo, at Spriestersbach Distinguished Lecturer of 2020. I also want to mention that Roberto Lugo is kind enough to do a question and answer that will take place on October 29th. Please see more information in the details of this post. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Roberto Lugo. I'm a potter, community activist, poet, among other things, and I'm thrilled to be able to show and share my artwork with you today. So this is a project, this first image here that I did in Philadelphia in conjunction with the Clay Studio. And how this came about was we were thinking of ways to be able to integrate into the community that the Clay Studio in Philadelphia was moving to. It was my old neighborhood in Kensington. And in thinking about that, I encouraged them to think about ways that we could not force an agenda or another culture outside of the culture that already exists in this neighborhood, a poor neighborhood made up mostly of people of color. And I thought of all the obstacles that it took for me to be able to get to where I am as an artist. And then I thought to myself, you know what we could do is I'll just set up a pottery wheel in the street and become part of the landscape of every day here in Philadelphia. And I just want to see how people would interact with that. And so then I set up a wheel, and every single time I did it, it was a different experience. This time around, several groups of children coming home from school just stopped. And in addition to seeing people playing basketball and the cars in the street and the things that they normally see, they saw someone that looked like them throwing pots. And it was a really magical experience. One of my former professors says this quote that I think of all the time, which is, perhaps what one wants to say we conceive of in our childhood and we spend the rest of our life trying to say it. And for me, a lot of my work stems from where I come from in Philadelphia. And in going back there, I thought of ways that I could use the skills that I've learned since being a maker in ceramics. And I designed this project with children in the Claymobile program, which is part of the Clay Studio in Philadelphia, where I asked them to make a self-portrait using 3 things that they like about themselves. And I saw this young man in the corner by himself, and he sort of reminded me reminded me of myself. And I walked up to him and I said, "Hey, Nassim, see, I see you're sculpting a chef." And he goes, "Yeah, I'm sculpting a chef." And I said, "You like to cook?" He goes, "Yeah, I like to cook." And I said, "Well, what do you like to cook?" He goes, "I don't have a signature dish yet." So, in addition to just finding great humor in that, one of the things that I found really profound was that, with this assignment, he was able to sort of like honor himself and pay homage to himself and think about the ways that he is um, special and unique. And that's not something that many people asked me when I was younger. And that brings me to this place where I think a lot of times I didn't see um, faces like mine in places of prominence. And it built this insecurity in me, this idea that whiteness meant greatness and whiteness meant some superiority over me. That's the systems that were taught growing up. So this project of me going out and teaching people how to throw on the potter's wheel was really amazing. About it was, in this experience, I was able to teach people who were just afraid of this camera and this wheel in front of them just minutes ago because they were selling drugs and didn't want anybody to be around, obviously, and especially anybody with a camera. But later on, when they became comfortable that we were not there for them, they came over and asked me to try the potter's wheel. And people in the local community who came out as sex workers and homeless people and just people walking around their daily routine stopped and tried to make pots and watched me make pots. And we got into a conversation about it. The objects that I make, I think are responsive to the world that I live in. Like, for example, these two works that have Mike Brown and Trayvon Martin. I didn't make them right after Mike Brown and Trayvon Martin died. I made them well after, several years after their passing, when they weren't in the news anymore and their faces weren't the subject of everyday news. And I thought a bit about how their lives just seemed like a like passing in the wind, and how ceramics last thousands of years, and by how putting them on these objects, they last for thousands of years, and their memories and the conversations of them last for that long. One of the first things that Mike Brown's mom said when she saw her son on the street was, "Do you know how hard it is to get a black man through high school?" And what that made me think of was the fact that my mom had so many experiences where I could have lost, I could have been lost in the streets so easily. And I think about all the things that I was able to have in my life because of my mother. For example, my first year in high school, I was really afraid for my life. So I applied to all the other local high schools in Philadelphia, within which I was declined from just a year before. And I was in this community school that was really dangerous. And at the end of the year, I had straight A's. And my mom said that we went to the school board. And at that particular time, we found out that my counselor never sent any of my applications to any of the other schools. And it took my mom fighting and looking for answers for us to be able to figure out the fact that we had not had the opportunity that we were supposed to have because of the poor education system around me. So that idea, those words from Mike Brown's mom, that you know how hard it is to get a black man through high school, very much reminded me of my own story. Some of the work that I do is to figure out a way to connect and talk with broad audiences. And, one of the things about that is maybe people that come from where I do don't have a deep understanding of ceramics or craft history, but you do get a sense that, orange and black in this pattern is reminiscent of pottery. Maybe somebody doesn't know that it's Greek pottery in particular, but we've seen it before. And the blue and white pattern here reminds them of Chinese pottery. But then also the blue and white pattern in the bottom of the Colin Kaepernick drawing reminds them of the Bloods and the Crips gangs. And so it's this interesting thing where people from different communities and cultures and backgrounds, lived experiences, will look at my works and find very particular elements that relate to them and that they understand. And that's really what I'm going for my work, in a way, a representation of people that are maybe underrepresented in these sort of like prominent places, and to pay honor to figures who have paved the way for me to have the opportunities that I do. So here's an example of where I grew up. This building in the middle was a store. And the top floors, this is a more recent picture, but the top floors here used to be abandoned and burnt down from the crack epidemic in Philadelphia. And my father bought the store that was in the bottom. And at the time, the stuff in the store was like Duran Duran buttons and Berenstain Bear records and those watches with the calculators on them. And, my father used all the money that he had from working in a factory to buy the store, but he didn't have a relationship with American culture and an understanding of what people would even go to a store for. And so he made this decision without the basic privilege of being welcomed into the society that he lived in, to have an understanding of like what people would even buy and what would be a good business decision. And some of this reminded me of when I read The Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison in college. I started to look back in my life, and one of the things that I realized is that somebody could be physically in a space, like I was physically in school and my father was physically there at that store, but we weren't participating. And it was almost like society and the world didn't count us. One of the ways that I try to communicate why racial diversity and diversity of all kinds is so important in artists and in the making process is because when I first sat down at the potter's wheel, there was a lot of things that happened that I didn't realize. First, I took a class in college because I wanted to be around people my age, and I was 25 at that point. And I grew up in a place where I had 50-something cousins and all the men were incarcerated. And I saw myself going down that same sort of negative route. And so I moved to Florida. And then at that point, I wanted to be around people my age, and I wanted to go to school for something where I didn't have to write and people wouldn't know where I came from. So when I sat at the wheel, even though I really enjoyed it, I immediately asked myself, is this for me? And I questioned, was I supposed to be there? And it immediately felt like somebody was going to tap me on the shoulder and say, hey, what are you doing here? Just because of my own insecurity that was put into me, that this is not something that I'm deserving of. So that when I sat down at the wheel, I had that feeling, but I also saw the wheel as a machine that makes round things. I didn't see it as a machine that made pottery, because pottery wasn't part of dialect that I grew up with. Handmade pottery, if you're worried about the food that you get to eat, you're not so worried about the dishes that you eat them out of. And so this particular object was an object made in my second pottery class, and it was a ceramic fire hydrant soap dispenser. And it was to commemorate when my father and I would shower into fire hydrants when our water was shut off. This brief video is going to give you an example of some of the things that I question with my work. One of the ideas is I question the use of the word ghetto, because I think often when people use the word ghetto, they're referring to Black and brown people and communities, and they're using it in the same context that we say, the DIY movement or being handy, but instead of being handy or being DIY, we're thinking to ourselves that this is ghetto. And I like to think that ghetto is a form of resourcefulness. Like when I was younger, my father he would find motors in washing machines that were thrown away, and he would take those motors and he would turn them into large food processors. And then in order to get the blade for the food processor, he'd take a tin can and put a screwdriver through it so that it'd be jagged, and he'd put enough marks in there where if you put a plantain through this machine, through this serrated edge, and with this motor going that quickly, it would pulverize it and turn it into a puree that we then would use to make a Puerto Rican dish called pasteles. So for me, that's a form of resourcefulness.
I always thought that the needle was what cured you or what helped you when you were sick. And I didn't realize it was a bad needle. This is about the time of the AIDS epidemic in Philadelphia. My mom was really scared after that, letting me play in that yard. Sometimes I sort of wish I could go back and step out, sort of pretending that we were driving around the city, and one of my aunts yells out, "Ice cream, ice cream." All my cousins were much older than me. They all ran and sort of like left me in the car, and I sort of did what I saw them all do, which was jump out of the window of the car, surgery, and getting my leg all sewn back up. I remember looking through the window of the room, the operating room, and my cousin was looking at me through the window and he cold drink. I think maybe even in some ways I was thinking back then, even as a little kid, that didn't matter what pain you had to go through as long as you could sort of get that soda at the end of it. I have 50-something first cousins, and I think I might be the only one with diabetes. Losing my hair, morbidly obese. I always had a hard time being good at anything. But at some point, a professor told me to try the potter's wheel, do something great out in the world. But the more we get used to just people, it was up because I.
So following that idea of resourcefulness, I also think a bit about skill sets that get transferred on to people like me, things that maybe people don't think are skill sets, things that maybe people think that are defects that actually equate to effects. You know, for example, when I was younger, my mom got a credit card application. She could pick whether she wanted a Visa or MasterCard. And my mom looks at me and she goes, "Robert, I'm going to get the Visa because nobody's the master but Jesus." And as humorous as that is, it was my mom trying to figure out words and their meaning. And, whenever she heard the word master, it was through church. And she didn't understand the use of the word master in this context. And then going outside, I would hear hip hop and them using the same sound or homonym to have several different meanings. So this thing that maybe somebody sees as a defect, maybe using the word in the wrong way, then comes to me as me being able to hear a sound and think of 3 different ways to use that same word. I don't take nothing for granted. Was born with a heart of granite, but granted, if I was granted chief commander, I would do better than Grant did. And that's with or without a grant, kid. In part, my work tries to be timely and connect certain subjects and throughout history. For example, this particular jar has a picture of Colin Kaepernick on one side and has an image of John Brown on the other side. And John Brown, during his day, was considered a controversial figure. He was a white man opposed to slavery and fighting to end and abolish slavery. And for me, I also think that in many ways, the things that Colin Kaepernick is fighting for, reminds me very much of this conversation that would have happened in John Brown's day. And we're even seeing the effects of that today, whereas the latest Black Lives Matter protests have encouraged and made the NFL and the NBA be in support of Black Lives Matter and be accepting of athletes who want to kneel during the national anthem in protest of police brutality. This particular piece is at the Indianapolis Museum. Another way that I find a relationship to my past and my current is thinking a bit about the ways that the graffiti that I grew up doing as a kid interacts with the ceramics that I'm doing now. The lines of calligraphy that are often done in Asian art through print or through ceramics reminds me of the way that we tag graffiti, the way that a can, if you overspray a can of spray paint, the way that it runs remind me of the way that glaze runs if you overfire it. Also, in terms of timeliness, I think a bit about the relationships between our current lives and our past. This piece on the right-hand side commemorates Gwendolyn Brooks, who is the first Black woman to win a Pulitzer Award. And, you know, it reminds me of Kendrick Lamar, who recently won one. And when he did, it was this really sort of shocking thing to the community. And what I wanted to do is I wanted to take that opportunity to be able to remind people of, you know, the past and poets that have, you know, changed and offered us innovation long ago, long before Kendrick Lamar. The piece on the left is of Michelle Obama, and it came during a time where 2016, when Trump was running for office, and Michelle Obama got on stage and said, "When they go low, we go high." And I had so much nerves at that particular point, and I really wanted to make a pot that said something special. And so I said, maybe what I can do is just spend a lot of time on that pot by making flowers and decorating it. And so, you know, all these roses really just show off my nerves that were happening during that time. Some of the work that I make is via commission. This particular piece is at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, and it's my interpretation of a century of Los Angeles. And so the form itself is inspired by the centennial vase, the century vase made for the 1876 World's Fair in Philadelphia, where we were trying to identify what makes America, America. And these vignettes were filled with all of our innovations. And so in this particular case, I'm sharing and showing innovations that have to do with my interpretation or maybe the urban interpretation of Los Angeles. And this particular piece is made actually with a real gun barrel. And this was a piece that was a part that was donated to me from a gun buyback program. And I thought about the physical relationships between a gun barrel and the spout for a teapot. And then when I put those things together, I thought about who better to honor with this than someone whose life was taken by gun violence. My work is also this investigatory, you know, I almost feel often like an ethnographer, like I'm using all these patterns that I find that are popular or that people are accustomed in the decorative arts, but I'm also thinking about ways to commemorate and document and pay homage to the culture that I grew up in. And so a pattern that I think, you know, makes sense or works in that vernacular would be like the Air Jordan pattern that you see here in the back, the bottom of these pots, these sneakers, this gray and black pattern. So these are sneaker bowls. These are a few examples of how maybe all these things come together in that the patterns, the African patterns that are above the portraits of Obama and MLK here, those colors are then infused into the Asian patterns that on the sides of this piece, this infinity pattern, and then my graffiti on the spouts of here. And so one of the things that I'm trying to do with my work is figure out how to harmonize all of these patterns and ideas that come from different parts of the world. So a large part of my work is in education, not only teaching street side, but giving lectures like this at museums, but also here's an example of me teaching at a senior citizen home center in Baltimore called the Zeta House, where we're working on mosaics. And in this process, I'm engaging with the culture and the people that I'm trying to represent with my work to get an idea of like, am I doing the right thing? Is my work making sense? I want to hear the stories of other people in addition to mine, so that when I'm making a work, it could really have the impact, the content that I want from it. For example, this particular piece on the right was made for the Walters Museum in an exhibition I had. And the exhibition was held and put together in the home of a former secessionist slave owner. And locally, a college in Baltimore had many images of enslaved peoples that were in their flat files, and images that really were the only mark that a person ever existed. And a lot of these images were anonymous, and we didn't know the names of the people. And I just thought about what a shame that a person lives a whole life and we don't even know who they are. We don't know their name. And what a difference it would make to put their portrait on a pot that lasts thousands of years. And not only that, but take that enslaved person's image and put them on the mantle in the very front, the most honored place in a household, the place where people would put their porcelain objects to show off, because at the time that these original objects that I'm using here were inspired, porcelain was considered more expensive than gold. Some of my work from this exhibition is part of the permanent collection at the Walters Museum. This particular piece that I made of Frederick Douglass, who was from Baltimore and did a lot of work in Baltimore, fills in this niche area where only the wealthy people, the people that own this home, would have been able to walk in these stairs, the servants having to walk in the stairs behind these stairs. And you can see a door here, and that was the servants' quarters and entrance. I see my work as an opportunity for people from all over to make connections and to have conversations maybe they otherwise wouldn't. It's a commentary on all the ways that diversity and inclusion together actually work to beautify and encourage innovative ideas and ways of being. I think a lot of times when people think of diversity, they think it's almost like a charitable cause, but in reality, when we have more diverse settings in all regards, it really creates a more enriching community. So I want to thank you for the opportunity to talk to you today about my work and what it is that I'm doing. I'm looking forward to engaging with you in conversations going forward. And I hope you enjoyed yourself. Thank you.